Hello everyone and welcome back. Today we'll be making a C# Windows application which allows the end user to interact with the data in a SQL Server 2005 Express Edition database. It will bind the data to the user interface controls on our forms. We'll just discuss datasets and the major classes of the system.data namespace. This is usually called ADO.NET. These tend to work together to give you a friendly programming interface which can be used in your applications and simplify retrieving and modifying data. Microsoft has really tried to make life easy for beginners by providing simple and interesting visual tools which make creating rich database applications easier, but they also expose the underlying classes that support this functionality. This way the advanced programmers can customize it in their way. So data binding is a feature of your user interface control which let them take out information from a data source like a database and show that information to the end user. Some controls will only show one field of data from a database. Some controls, like the data grid view, can show many fields of multiple rows of data within its grid. Some controls will let you edit the fields of data, which will then update the original data source automatically with those updated values. So let's begin with a set of classes in the system.data namespace, which we call ADO.NET. ADO stands for Active Data Objects. ADO.NET manages the connection to the database regardless of the type of database or other data sources which you want to connect to. A connection includes the process of finding the database by using the file system or network protocol and begins the handshaking to talk to the database. The application can speak to the database as long as the connection is open. ADO.NET also manages both the request the application makes to retrieve the data from the database and the response from the database to return the requested data back to you. There are also a series of classes which ADO.NET has, and these manage the set of data which is returned from the database query, so you can write code to evaluate each field of data that you want to navigate row by row. Lastly, there's a class that will manage which row of data has been retrieved and send it to the current row. So if there are 10 rows of data which your application returned from the database, all the user interface controls on your form need to know that they are all looking for the current row, like maybe row 3. So each control on a form all need to be looking at the respective field that they need to display that belong to the same row of data. And there's a class which manages that current row of data. This basically tells the controls on the form that a new row of data is now the current row, so based on that they should update their values. Now, why do we build applications that provide access to a database when I've already shown you how easy it is just to open up the database and add and remove rows from there? So, to begin with, to really get a lot out of the database, the user needs to have a certain level of aptitude. This way they can effectively interact with the data in a database. When you make a friendly user interface, the idea is to simplify the learning process for the end user, so they can do their job without having to worry about word error message that came back or worrying about referential integrity or some complex query. So there's a lot of functionality that you can simplify just by the fact that you're building an application that sits on top of the database. Secondly, there may be data in the database that you want secure, and you want to ensure that the data can only be accessed by certain users or certain computers. You may want to log who's making certain amendments to certain fields. So that's the reason you need to control it through the user interface. This will give you more programmatic control over who's doing what to the data. Thirdly, in the case of a website, you might want to display data in a database like a product catalogue for companies' products. So here you wouldn't just put the database on the internet, it's not aesthetically pleasing and you probably wouldn't have much of an impact either. Instead, you'd provide a web page template which can access the database and display the information in a template format to the end user. And usually you wouldn't want the user to access the database directly because there's a chance they may mess it up. You need to ensure the data in the database is correct, relevant, and properly formatted. Sometimes it seems your users will try to prevent you from doing this. So by restricting their access to the underlying data to make applications that do checks on the entry, on the changing of the information, can maintain the integrity of the data. Also making sure that it is correct, that it is well formed, but they haven't deleted things they shouldn't have. There'll also be many other reasons why you'd want to create user interface on top of the database instead of allowing the end user to access the database directly. So I've created a new project called Lesson 9. I've added a new .mdf file, a new database file called My Company. Within the My Company file, I've added a single table called Customer. In the main area, I have the definition for the customer table. There are 3 fields: Customer ID, which is the key to the table and is a type integer, and when you scroll down to the properties area, you'll find it is an identity column. The next field is first name of type nvarchar with the size of 50. Then last name nvarchar with the size of 50. This is also the default. So now in this table are 4 rows of information, basically 4 made up customers. Now I need to create a data source, so go to Data, Menu option, and select Add New Data Source. This will bring up the data source configuration wizard. Here the database is selected by default, but there's also other types of data source to choose from. So now select the Next button, then choose the data connection. Now as we create a database file in a project, our project already knows of this database, as we saw from our Database Explorer. Our project already has a connection which we can work from, which is in that window on the left hand side, covered up by our configuration wizard. There's no need to create a new connection, as by default it can already find the database that we want to work with. It can also select other databases which our project knows, or create a new connection to an external database that's not currently linked with our project. They could also look at the connection string, which is just some information that ADO.NET needs to know about in order to find and handshake with the database. So you can select the Next button here, and right now it's looking through the database to try to find the different objects which are available. So if I go down here and find our customer database, from this you'll get a dataset definition. Now it asks for the data name, so leave that at the default and select the Finish button and see what is created. Once the wizard is completed, you'll notice a single file was added to our application called My Company dataset.xsd. Now .xsd file extension means that this file is an XML schema document. So imagine it as the table definition for our local copy of the database. So now the actual data will be saved in our .mdf file. But as our application is running, we're going to copy some of that data for our temporary use here into a dataset that will be used within our application. The .xsd file defines the structure of the dataset, which will be used internally. Now once we have added and deleted records to and from our dataset, updated records, then those amendments will be put back into the original data source, mycompany.mdf. This will be done through the use of some special ADO.NET components. There are some wonderful advantages of working with data in this way, and you'll see how it works in the example. So the Visual C Sharp 2005 Express Edition lets us look at this document rather pictorially. This is due to the fact represented through a lot of funny characters we can look at in Notepad. But we'll just look at the friendly representation that the IDE presents for us. So there's an element called customer and some child elements called customer ID, first name and last name. This is pretty much the same as what's in our database. This you can see through our Database Explorer on the left hand side in our customer table with 3 fields: customer ID, first and last name. The reason they are the same is because once we retrieve information from mycompany.mdf into our local copy called dataset, the structure needs to be similar so that the data has to be in a logical place. So basically, first name should go into the first name field and last name within its respective field. When we have this dataset, over here we can make amendments, and it doesn't make a difference to our original data source, which is the mycompany.mdf file. This is not important at the moment, I just wanted to show you what an XSD file looked like. So now we want to open the form1.cs. This was automatically created when we created Lessons 9. So from the data menu, select Show Data Sources, and that opens a new window, which by default on the left hand side of my IDE. Here you can switch between the toolbox and the Database Explorer. You'll see here there's another representation of customer ID, first name and last name. This has come from the My Company dataset. So if you go on the drop down list on the customer ID, you'll see it has data grid view, details and null. This lets us define the default way that this set of elements can be represented on a form whenever we use data binding. So I'll set this to data, grid view, and then drag it from data sources and drop it onto our form. Visual C Sharp 2005 Express Edition basically does everything for us automatically. It firstly creates a toolbar and a grid, then there are lots of controls in the designer tray. So now we'll run the application and see what this application can do. I just need to drag and drop and I get the functionality of a complete application. I could scroll through and look at information in a grid which is from my database. I can also use this toolbox element to move around the database by going to the first record or the last record. By selecting this button, I can add a row and type in anything. I can select to delete items from the database, and I can then save the changes. It will basically take from the local copy of the data, which we're working with at the moment, and will then put any changes from the dataset back into the original data source, the mycompany.mdf database. So here we have another option. This is the detail view. We'll use the delete key on my keyboard to delete everything one by one. Then set this to details and drag and drop this onto the designer surface. So now there's a different visual representation of the data. We'll rerun the application. Now instead of a grid view, I get a form view where I can go navigate between the first and last records. And create a new item, delete it, and can save the data back to its original file. So these are representations of the exact same data. I can also still add things to my application, create new items on my form. I can do some validation. I can make the customer ID field read-only, for example, if I don't want the user to enter anything. So basically I still have full programmability of my form. Visual C Sharp 2005 Express Edition data binding features let me get to this point very quickly without writing code or worrying about which objects I need, so I can do a lot without worrying about how the whole thing works. But in our case, we want to understand more about the items that were added to our form. In both the details view or the grid view, items were added both to the form and design tray. The first item is an object called MyDataSet, which is the local container for the data that we want within our application. Once our form opens, the database fills the dataset with data. The customer table adapter, which is in the design tray, enables this to happen. This table adapter knows how to retrieve data from the database. It contains a connection to the database, so it contains an object within the table adapter and knows how to connect to our mycompany.ndf. I can also retrieve information and resolve that information back into the database. So if we deleted a record, it has information which knows how to work with the customer table so that one row of data could be deleted, updated, and added. So then we have the customer binding source. This object acts as a bridge between the information in the dataset and the current row which shows on the form. It coordinates with all the text boxes to decide which row of data within the dataset in the temporary storage container should currently be displaying on all fields which want to display information about the current row. So we wouldn't have one text box look at row 3 and the other text box look at row 4 and give out the wrong information. The idea of customer binding source is to keep all the controls on the form bound to the same row of data and update and give messages to those text boxes and tell it that the user showed what the user showed, that they wanted to go to the next row or the last row. So make the changes according to that. Lastly, there is a customer binding navigator. This is the toolbar right at the top of our form. This lets us go to the first, next and last. We can use these controls through the toolbox. So we have a dataset, the grid view, the binding source, the binding navigator, all in the data section of our toolbox. These controls could all have been added and configured manually onto our form. They could have been named correctly, i.e. with the word customer prefix to the type object they are, but this was all done automatically for us by the data source window. One other item in this are the properties in each control on the form. These allow binding with a specific field within the dataset. If we scroll down and look at the text property of the text box, you'll see a small database icon. If I hover my cursor over it, you'll notice it's bound to the customer binding source, particularly the customer ID field. Scroll down further and we come to the data section of the properties window for the text box. If we open this data bindings rolled up area and take a look at this text property and use the down arrow on the combo box, a visual window opens which allows me to select a given binding source and a specific field within it. The schema document, which we originally created in our project, is providing this info. The binding source knows how to communicate with the dataset and relate that back to the text box control, that it should be bound to the customer ID. So by using the data source window and dragging and dropping, we can set that automatically. So now let's create another form in our application and see how to set things up manually. We'll use the default name form2.cs. We will add everything we need on the form manually, like the list box, two text boxes and a button. We'll go back to form 1 and put a button in here as well. We'll need to know how to open one form from another form. So forms are classes, so to create a new instance of the form 2 class, you would do form 2 or f equals new form 2, and then look at this instance of our form, which has a show method. And that should be what we need. Now try it. So we need lots of components to connect it to the database. In my toolbox, there are some strongly typed versions of some components available, like a customer table adapter and a My Company dataset. As mentioned, these are strongly typed versions of these components. If I was to go to the data section and drag and drop the dataset, you'll find the table adapter, etc., but these are already pre-configured for use, as they are already associated with other items within our application. So I'll drag and drop the My Company dataset instance onto my design surface. Then run the application and click button 1. But nothing happens. Looks like we haven't done enough because there's nothing that appeared in our list box or text boxes. So we'll return to form 1 in the designer. See if anything was added by the IDE for us. We can actually see some things have been added. Because of the way that we added and removed items from our form, it seems there's some redundant code, 3 copies of the exact same piece of information. But we can see that we're calling customer table adapter.fill and then passing in the My Company dataset.customer. Which means we need to do the same thing. The this keyword refers to the parent objects. So similarly to how a form is a class and we created an instance of a form, the this keyword refers to the current instance of the current object. So here, this customer table adapter instead of the customer table adapter that belongs to another instance of the current form. So now we'll create a similar line of code whenever the form first opens up. We will need to add a line that looks like the following: customer table adapter 1.fill. Then we can just pass in My Company dataset.1 or specify that we want to work specifically with the customer table. So the fill method basically grabs the data from the database and then fills the customer table of the dataset with the data it retrieved. Now we need to tell the list box that it should be data bound to the dataset. So using the task arrow, I'll select Use Data Bound Items. This will allow me to select the data source and then select from form 2, list instances, My Company dataset 1, then select the display number, then use the last name and the value for that. I want to select the customer ID. The difference between the display number, the value number, is that you can view the display number in the list box, but each item within a list box has an underlying value associated with it. It could be the exact same, such as the name could be here too, but due to the fact that two people could have the same last name, it's better to use the customer ID, which is always unique. So now we'll save this and run our application. You'll see that there's a list of the 4 names because we have filled the dataset with data, and we've told the list box to specifically bind our customer table to the dataset, and particularly the last name field of the customer table. What we now want to do is bind up the text box controls on the right hand side, so that when an item is selected from the list on the left, the first and the last name will be visible in the text boxes on the right. So if we just need read-only functionality, where we just want people to only be able to read the values, then it's quite simple. We just select the items and go into the Properties window, find the Data Binding section for the text box, go to that text property of the Data Binding section, then click the down arrow on the combo box. This will let us select the data source and data element that will be used to fill that text box. We'll use Form 2 listers so that we can look at our instance of the My Company dataset. The name is My Company dataset 1, and that is this object which has been dragged to our designer surface. When we expand it, we can see the customer element and the child element's first name. Then we'll do the same to get the last name associated with this text box. And now let's run it. Now the reason this will work is because it supports some of the same functionality that the binding source object will support with regards to keeping track of navigation, etc. To get the most out of our application, say we want to make a change, we want this saved back into the original dataset and to make it work with the least number of lines of code necessary. We need to add a binding source to manage that process. So in the data section of the toolbox, select the binding source, and in the description you see it says that encapsulates the data source for form and provides navigation, filtering, sorting and updating capabilities. Many things that you can do, you can go through all the records set by using code, by using a method called next or previous or first or last. You could filter through the dataset to only return those items that may have a particular last name you're searching for. We'll use it to give us some updating capabilities, so we don't need to write a lot of code in order to save the changes from the form back to the original data source. I've added the data source object to the design tray. Then I'll select it, then set some properties, specifically the data source, which I'll set to project data sources, My Company dataset, and select the data members, which is the customer table. Then bind the list box and 2 text boxes to the binding source. So we'll remove the bindings that we have directly to the dataset and move those bindings to the new data source object that we created. So you can think of it as the middleman which manages between the controls on the form and the underlying dataset. So we'll select our list box and go to data source. Binding source 1 is now available. Select that and change the display number and value number. So we'll display the last name and change the value back to the customer ID. Same thing for the text boxes. Go to our new binding source object, go down and find the first name to replace the binding to the dataset. We'll do the same replacement by going to the last name text box, then navigating to the binding source and finding the last name. We'll now save and run the application. We want to make sure the binding still works, so we can select from a list on the left hand and see the results on the right, and it still seems to work. Now we want to modify the example to make a change to the data. Click our button and save it back onto the database. Double-click the button, so first we need to tell the binding source that we've finished editing, and when we do it, it will save any changes we've made to the dataset, and then we need to take the changes that were made to the dataset and save them back to the original data source, which is the database. So we'll first use the binding source. So binding source 1 and edit. That will take any changes that were made while we bound to the binding source. We'll save them back to its underlying source, which is our dataset. Now we'll save the dataset back to the database. The table adapter knows how to communicate with the database, so our specific instance of the table adapter is customer table adapter 1.update. We can choose from one data row to a set of data rows to the entire dataset to just a single table within the dataset to pass in. We'll pass in the last overload, so my company dataset 1.customer. When this update happens, it will return back to us the number of items that were updated. So we can create int results equals 0, and whilst it's not essential to capture this, we can view how many rows were affected back into the original database. Then do messagebox.show, then result.toString. This will give us some feedback from the application that the save should have worked. So save and run the application. Click button 1 and it all works. Click button 1, so the result variable was able to capture that one row was modified in the database. Shut this down and open it again. Select Robert and see Gareth is now saved to the database. So it all seems to work. So you can now see that with data binding we can make full-featured applications. Writing applications which show information from the database to the end user by just dragging and dropping some things into place and getting a lot of functionality without having to write virtually any code. Also being able to make modifications to how the data binding works, setting things manually so that we can customize the functionality how we want. And also allow us to update any changes that were made back to the database. So we discussed datasets, function of a table adapter, the binding source, and the XSD. So we covered a lot today, and we can now create full-featured applications featuring data which we can display to our end users. This is one of the best functions within Visual C# 2005 Express Edition, because you don't have to write much code. It does most of the things for you automatically. So anyway, I do hope you enjoyed this lesson, and until next time, take care.